Prince George stepped confidently into the spotlight at Buckingham Palace, taking on the most significant royal duty of his young life.
It was supposed to be just another quiet afternoon in the palace, but for young Prince George, one wrong turn down a corridor would change everything. Through a half-open door, he saw something no child should witness. Camilla, the Queen consort, standing over a desk tearing into delicate cream envelopes. The handwriting on them was unmistakable, his grandmother Diana's. What followed was a chain of whispers, confrontations, and a decision so shocking it would rock the royal family to its core. The Queen consort was gone, her absence explained only in polite press statements, while the truth burned behind palace doors. Stay with me as we uncover what George saw, how it reached William, and why it ended with Camilla's banishment. Subscribe now because some royal secrets are too explosive to remain hidden. A rainy afternoon in the archive room. Rain fell in steady sheets against the palace windows, turning the gardens outside into a blur of silver and green. The sound was soft but constant, a background hum that seemed to wrap the entire building in stillness. Most of the family were occupied with their own routines. Staff moved quietly through the corridors, their footsteps muffled on thick carpets. It was the kind of day where nothing unusual was expected to happen. Prince George had been working on a history project for school, a report that required him to include personal accounts and old photographs from the royal archives. Catherine had suggested he speak to one of the archivists for guidance, but George had decided to explore first. With a notebook tucked under his arm, he wandered through the less traveled parts of the palace, following the faint scent of aged paper and polished wood. His small sneakers made almost no sound as he turned down a corridor he rarely visited. At the very end, half hidden behind a heavy oak door, was the archive room. He had only been there once before, during a guided family tour when he was younger. Back then, he had not understood the significance of what the room held. Now his curiosity was sharper. The door creaked slightly as he pushed it open. The air inside was cooler and carried the faint, distinct smell of parchment and leather. Rows of cabinets and shelves lined the room, each carefully labeled. Glass display cases held old photographs, handwritten speeches, and neatly stacked letters in cream-colored envelopes. The light filtering in through the tall windows was soft and gray, casting gentle shadows on the polished floor. George stepped inside slowly, glancing at the small brass plaques that described each section. There were collections from state visits, binders of official correspondence, and a section dedicated to personal mementos from various members of the family. He recognized the names on some of the labels, but one in particular caught his eye: Diana, Princess of Wales. He moved toward it almost without thinking. Behind the glass were photographs of a young woman smiling at crowds, holding hands with children, and speaking to hospital patients. Next to them were letters written in looping, elegant handwriting. He pressed closer to the glass, trying to read the opening lines. The writing felt warm, as if it had been meant for someone close. He traced the edge of the display with his eyes, imagining what it must have been like to meet her. Catherine had told him stories, and his father spoke of her with quiet pride. But here, surrounded by her words and images, she felt more real. The rain outside tapped steadily against the window panes, a reminder of the world beyond the quiet room. George thought about his project and how these letters might help him understand not just the history, but the person behind it. He did not yet know that this quiet afternoon spent in a forgotten corner of the palace would lead him to witness something that would change the way he saw the family forever. The shocking sight. George had not expected anyone else to be in the archive room that afternoon. He had stepped into the corridor outside to find a particular book he thought might be kept on a nearby shelf. When he returned, the door to the room was not quite closed as it had been before. It hung open just enough for him to see inside. At first, he thought it might be one of the archivists doing their usual work. He took a step closer, curious to see if he could ask a question. But as he reached the doorway, he froze. Standing at the center table was Camilla, her posture tense, her eyes fixed on the contents in her hands. George's gaze fell to what she was holding: a neat stack of cream-colored envelopes. each with handwriting he recognized from the display he had just been admiring. It was the same elegant script that had been on the letters marked under his grandmother's name. Diana's handwriting. Before he could say anything, she slipped one envelope from the pile and opened it. She read a few lines, her lips tightening. Then, without hesitation, she tore the sheet of paper cleanly in half. The sound of ripping echoed sharply in the quiet room. George's breath caught. He stood perfectly still, his small fingers gripping the edge of the doorway. Camilla took another letter from the pile. Again, her eyes moved quickly over the words, and again the paper was torn in two, this time with more force. Pieces fluttered down onto the table, one half sliding toward the floor. She muttered something under her breath, too low for George to hear clearly. The tone, however, was unmistakably sharp. She gathered the torn halves into a small pile at the edge of the table. Without looking up, she reached for yet another envelope. George's chest felt tight. These were not just old pieces of paper. They were part of his grandmother's story, words she had written with her own hand. He thought of the way his father's voice softened whenever he spoke about her, the way Catherine's eyes shone when she told stories of her kindness. And here was someone close to his family, destroying them as if they were nothing. He stepped back slightly, careful not to make a sound. His mind raced. Should he say something? Should he call out to her? But something in the intensity of her movements made him hesitate. He felt that if she knew he had seen this, it might cause trouble he could not fully understand. Camilla continued, moving through the stack with quick, decisive motions. Another letter opened, another letter ripped. Her focus never wavered from the task, and she did not glance toward the door once. George's pulse hammered in his ears. Without another thought, he turned and walked quickly down the corridor, his sneakers silent on the carpet. He did not stop until he was far from the archive room. The image of torn paper drifting to the floor was already burned into his memory, and he knew he would not forget it. A child's silent exit. George moved quickly down the corridor, his steps light but hurried, glancing over his shoulder once to make sure no one was following. The palace seemed unusually quiet, as if the rain outside had softened every sound. His heart was still beating faster than normal, and he could not shake the image of Camilla standing over the table, tearing through the letters with steady hands. When he reached the main staircase, he paused for a moment to catch his breath. There were staff members nearby, moving between rooms, but he avoided their eyes. He did not want anyone to stop him or ask why he looked so unsettled. He had learned, even at his young age, that in the palace, not everything was spoken about openly, and not every truth was easy to share. Instead of heading to the study or the sitting room where his parents sometimes worked, he climbed the stairs to his own bedroom. Once inside, he closed the door softly and leaned against it for a moment, letting the quiet surround him. His room was warm and familiar, filled with books, school supplies, and the framed photographs that Catherine had placed around his desk. Yet even here, the memory of what he had just seen seemed to follow him like a shadow. He moved to his desk and switched on his tablet. Without really thinking about it, he opened a browser and typed his grandmother's name. Dozens of images appeared. Smiling photographs of Diana greeting crowds, holding William as a baby, kneeling to speak to children at eye level. George scrolled slowly, pausing on pictures where her eyes seemed to look directly into the camera. He studied her face closely, trying to imagine her voice and the way she might have spoken to him if they had met. His father's stories painted a picture of someone warm and gentle, someone who cared deeply for people no matter who they were. But the letters, they were pieces of her he could never know firsthand, words she had chosen carefully, moments of her thoughts frozen in ink. And now, someone had chosen to destroy them. He felt an ache in his chest, a mixture of sadness and confusion. Why would anyone do that, especially someone in the family? He thought about telling his parents immediately, but a knot formed in his stomach. What if they thought he had misunderstood? What if they believed it was simply a misunderstanding or an official task? He was only a child, and sometimes adults dismissed what children saw. So he kept silent. He placed his tablet down, climbed onto his bed, and lay staring at the ceiling. Outside, the rain kept falling, the sound tapping gently against the windows. That night, as he prepared to sleep, the image returned again and again. The delicate cream envelopes, the flowing handwriting, the tearing sound, and the scattered halves of paper sliding to the floor. He told himself that tomorrow he would try to forget it. But deep down, he already knew it was something he could never truly forget, confiding in Charlotte. The palace was quiet after dinner, the long corridors lit only by the soft glow of wall lamps. George lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of what he had seen pressing down on him. He turned onto his side, restless, until a light tap sounded at his door. When he called for the visitor to come in, Princess Charlotte slipped inside, still in her nightclothes, her hair slightly messy from the evening's games. She sat on the edge of his bed, tilting her head. "You have been acting strange all day," she said in a low voice. "What happened?" George hesitated, glancing toward the door as if to make sure no one could hear. Then, in a whisper, he told her everything. He described walking into the archive room, seeing Camilla at the table, the stack of cream-colored envelopes, the sound of tearing paper, and the way pieces had fallen to the floor. Charlotte's eyes widened. Those were Granny Diana's letters, weren't they? George nodded slowly. "I think so. I saw her name on them earlier. The handwriting was the same. She ripped them up, Charlotte, all of them." Charlotte frowned, folding her arms. "You have to tell Mummy and Daddy." "I do not know," George replied, his voice uncertain. "What if they think I am making it up? What if they say it was for some official reason?" Charlotte leaned closer, her tone firm for someone so young. "Then we find proof. If you are right, there will still be something left in the bin. People do not always clean up properly." Her determination gave George pause, but he finally agreed. "Tomorrow morning," he said quietly, "before anyone goes in there." The next day, the palace was still waking when George and Charlotte slipped out of their rooms. They moved quickly but quietly, careful to avoid the main corridors where staff might spot them. The archive room was just as George remembered it, the tall windows letting in soft, early light. Charlotte closed the door behind them while George walked straight to the large waste bin near the central table. His heart thudded in his chest as he leaned over and peered inside. At first, he saw only a few crumpled sheets and discarded envelopes. Then he noticed the fragments, small, uneven pieces of thick paper, some with words still visible. He picked one up carefully, turning it over in his hand. The ink was faded but clear, and at the bottom, in the same elegant script he had seen in the display case, was a signature: Diana. Charlotte came to his side, her eyes fixed on the fragment. "That is her," she whispered. They gathered a few more pieces, enough to see that these were indeed parts of personal letters. Some had complete words: kind, William, hope, while others were just lines or curves of ink. Each piece felt heavier than it looked, as if carrying the weight of what had been lost. Charlotte's voice was steady. "Now we can tell them. They will have to believe you." George closed his hand around the fragment with Diana's name. For the first time since he had witnessed it, he felt certain of what they needed to do next: Catherine's discovery. Morning light streamed softly through the tall windows of Catherine's private sitting room. She sat at her desk, reviewing a small stack of correspondence, her pen poised to sign a reply. The gentle quiet of the moment was interrupted by the sound of the door creaking open. Charlotte stepped inside, holding something carefully in both hands as though it might break. George followed closely behind, his eyes lowered, his steps slower than usual. "Mummy," Charlotte began, her voice softer than Catherine was used to, "we need to show you something." She approached the desk and placed a torn fragment of thick paper on top of the letters Catherine had been reading. Catherine glanced at it, expecting a piece from one of the children's school projects. But the instant her eyes met the handwriting, her posture shifted. The ink was faint with age, yet the elegant flowing script was unmistakable. She had seen it before, in photographs, in cards William had kept, and in the few precious original notes carefully preserved within the family. "This is your grandmother Diana's handwriting," Catherine said quietly, looking between Charlotte and George. "Where did you find this?" Charlotte hesitated, her gaze flicking to her brother. George found it. He saw something yesterday. Catherine turned her full attention to George, her voice calm but carrying a steady seriousness. What did you see, sweetheart? George shifted uncomfortably, his fingers fidgeting. I was in the archive room, he began, his tone hesitant. I was looking for things for my school project. The door was open, and I saw Camilla. She had a stack of letters. They looked like the ones in the display case with Granny Diana's name on them. She tore them up, one after another. Catherine's breath caught, but her expression remained composed for his sake. Are you certain they were hers? George nodded with conviction. I saw the same handwriting earlier in the case, and Charlotte and I went back this morning. We found these pieces in the bin. This one has her name on it. Catherine picked up the fragment, turning it gently in her fingers. The signature stood out clearly, as though it had been written only yesterday. A cold awareness spread through her. These were not public letters. These were private thoughts, personal reflections that might never have been read outside of Diana's closest circle. Did anyone else see this happen? She asked quietly. George shook his head. Just me. I did not tell anyone yesterday because I thought maybe no one would believe me. But Charlotte said we should get proof. Catherine reached forward and drew both children into a gentle embrace. You did the right thing bringing this to me, both of you. She held them for a moment before releasing them, her mind already racing through the implications. William had always protected his mother's belongings with quiet devotion. This was no minor breach of royal procedure. It was a violation of memory and of trust. Looking into her children's solemn faces, Catherine felt a firm resolve take root. She would tell William, and once she did, there would be no avoiding the consequences. William's quiet investigation. William listened in silence as Catherine recounted what George and Charlotte had told her. She handed him the fragment with Diana's signature, and he studied it for a long moment, the familiar handwriting stirring something deep within him. There was no doubt in his mind that it was authentic. The question now was how it had ended up torn and discarded in a bin. He decided not to confront anyone immediately. Instead, he would confirm the facts himself. Later that afternoon, under the pretext of looking for a speech draft, William made his way to the archive room. The air inside was cool and faintly musty, the tall cabinets standing like guardians of the past. He moved straight to the section marked for his mother's personal correspondence. A small leather-bound logbook sat on a side table, recording every item held in the collection. William flipped through the pages carefully, scanning the lists of envelopes and letters, each marked with an accession number. Several of them stood out, entries that had been crossed out in neat, thin lines. The dates next to them were recent, all within the last 2 weeks. He compared the crossed-out entries to what was currently in the display case and the storage drawers. As he suspected, those letters were nowhere to be found. Each missing entry matched the description of the envelopes George had seen in Camilla's hands. William replaced the logbook exactly as he had found it and left the archive room. He headed to a smaller private office where the head archivist was known to work. The archivist, an older man with a careful manner, rose when William entered, clearly surprised by the visit. I wanted to ask you about some changes to the records, William began, keeping his tone polite but measured. A number of my mother's letters appear to have been removed recently. Can you explain why? The archivist hesitated, his fingers tightening on the edge of the desk. Your Royal Highness, they were removed for review, he said finally. By whose instruction? William asked, his gaze steady. The man's eyes flickered briefly toward the door before he answered. The request came from someone in the Queen Consort's office. I was told it was a matter of internal discretion. I was not given further details. William absorbed this in silence. His voice was calm when he spoke again, but there was no mistaking the edge beneath it. Were they returned to you after review? The archivist shook his head. Not yet. I assumed they were still in private custody. William thanked him and left without another word. As he walked back through the corridors, the confirmation weighed heavily on him. George's account was true. The letters had been taken deliberately and the order had come from Camilla's own circle. Whatever her reasons, she had crossed a line. These were not just historical documents, they were fragments of his mother's life, irreplaceable and personal. William knew the next step would not be quiet at all. The time for subtlety was quickly running out. The private showdown. The meeting room was small by palace standards, its walls lined with framed landscapes and a single polished table at the center. William had chosen it deliberately. It was away from the main offices, quiet and unlikely to draw attention. When Camilla entered, she looked faintly irritated, as though she had been pulled from something more important. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, her tone cool. "Yes," William replied, his voice calm but leaving no room for pleasantries. He closed the door and turned the key, the soft click marking the start of a conversation neither of them could easily walk away from. "I have spoken to the archivist," William began, stepping toward the table. "Several of my mother's letters were removed from the archive on instructions from your office. Those same letters have not been returned. I think you know why." Camilla's expression did not change at first. "I do," she said after a pause. "I read them. Some of the sentiments in those letters were unwise. If they were ever leaked, they could harm the monarchy and everything it stands for. I thought it best to remove the risk entirely." William's eyes narrowed. "By tearing them apart?" "They were personal, yes, but also potentially damaging," she answered evenly. "I did what I believed was necessary to protect the institution." William's voice hardened, each word deliberate. "You did not protect the institution. You disrespected my mother's memory. Those letters were her words, her thoughts, and her truths. You destroyed them without consulting anyone, without consulting me, her son." Camilla straightened slightly as though bracing herself. "I did not think there was time for drawn-out discussions. These things are best handled quickly." "You handled nothing," William said sharply. "You tore apart something that can never be replaced. And in doing so, you hurt my son. George saw you. He stood in the doorway of the archive room and watched you rip his grandmother's letters in half. He is a child, but he understood enough to know that what you did was wrong. Do you have any idea what that feels like for him?" For the first time, a flicker of discomfort crossed Camilla's face. "I did not know he was there," she said quietly. "That is the problem," William replied, his voice low but fierce. "You were so focused on erasing those pages that you forgot they were part of a person's life. My mother is gone. Her voice exists now only in the memories of those who loved her and in the words she left behind. And you decided those words did not matter." A heavy silence filled the room. Camilla looked away briefly, her hand tightening on the back of a chair. William stepped back from the table, his expression unreadable but resolute. "This ends here," he said finally. "No more interference with my mother's belongings. The rest of her letters will be secured elsewhere, away from you. And you will stay away from my children when it comes to anything involving her." He unlocked the door and stepped aside. Camilla left without another word, her footsteps fading into the corridor, leaving behind a silence that seemed to linger long after she was gone. The banishing decision. The news reached Charles in the late afternoon. He had been seated in his study, reading through a thick stack of state papers, when an aide appeared at the doorway with a cautious knock. The look on the man's face conveyed more than any opening sentence could. Without a word, Charles set the papers aside, leaning back slightly as if bracing himself for impact. What followed was a measured but unflinching account of Camilla's destruction of Diana's letters, William's confrontation in the royal library, and the visible hurt the ordeal had inflicted on young George. The aide spoke without embellishment, his voice steady but low, as though each detail carried its own gravity. Charles listened without interruption. His hands rested on the carved armrests of his chair, fingers tightening just slightly as the truth sank in. By the end, there was no visible outburst, no anger flaring into words. Instead, his face bore the stillness of someone who had been handed a weight they had long dreaded but could no longer ignore. It was not fury that settled over him, but a deep and heavy weariness. That evening, Charles summoned William and Catherine to a private sitting room. The rain outside tapped steadily against the tall windows, a persistent rhythm that seemed to fill the spaces between their words. William spoke first, recounting the events in full, how the missing letters had been noticed, how Charlotte had found torn fragments in the waste bin, and how Camilla's own admission had confirmed the truth. Catherine followed, her voice calm but edged with quiet conviction, describing the toll it had taken on George's trust. When the room fell silent, Charles remained still for a long moment, eyes lowered to the intricate weave of the carpet. At last he spoke. "It is not only the act that is wrong," he said, his tone even but resolute. "It is the intent. To erase another person's voice, that is unforgivable." It was rare for Charles to speak with such stark finality, rarer still for there to be no counterpoint, no discussion of protocol, no debate over public image. In that moment, all three knew there was no repairing what had been broken. They agreed it could not be addressed openly without creating a public fracture too deep to mend. But to do nothing was equally unthinkable. Charles proposed what he called a necessary withdrawal. Camilla would leave the palace under the guise of a personal retreat, her absence framed as a period of rest after a demanding schedule. Behind closed doors, the truth would be clear to those who needed to know. The following morning, her public engagements vanished from the official diary. Staff moved quietly through the corridors, packing her belongings into cases bound for a secluded countryside residence. No statement linked her departure to the incident, but the whispers began almost immediately. The air within the palace shifted, lighter for some, tense for others. George noticed her absence, though Catherine offered only that sometimes people make mistakes that require time away. For Charles, the decision cut deeper than he allowed anyone to see. He stood at the window as the car carried Camilla beyond the palace gates, his reflection merging with the gray clouds above. By nightfall, the silence within the palace was heavier than ever, and everyone understood that a line had been crossed that would never be stepped back over. Restoring the legacy. The decision to safeguard Diana's surviving letters was made without hesitation. William took personal charge, arriving in the archive room early in the morning while the palace was still waking. He instructed the archivists to locate every remaining piece of correspondence, every personal note, every scrap of paper that had once passed through his mother's hands. No document was left unchecked. The team worked in silence, wearing white cotton gloves as they lifted each letter, sliding it into protective sleeves. The air in the room was thick with the scent of aged paper and the unspoken weight of what was being preserved. Once every piece was accounted for, they were carefully arranged in order, packed into a reinforced case, and sealed. The destination was whispered to only a handful of trusted individuals, a secure and undisclosed location, far from the palace's reach, guarded by measures few could bypass. It was not only about keeping them safe from destruction, it was about keeping them safe from those who might twist their meaning. When the final case clicked shut, William stood still for a long moment. He knew these letters were more than ink and paper. They were fragments of a life cut short, unfiltered glimpses into the mind and heart of his mother. Protecting them was an act of defiance, but it was also an act of devotion. That evening, as rain tapped gently against the drawing room windows, William sat down with George and Charlotte by the fire. The glow of the flames softened the room, their faces lit with flickers of gold. He told them that family history was like a tapestry, woven from stories, memories, and truths. If one thread was pulled away, the whole could begin to unravel. Diana's words, he explained, were part of their heritage, and guarding them was a duty as sacred as it was personal. George listened intently, his brow furrowed as though trying to commit every word to memory. Charlotte tilted her head, her small hands folded in her lap, and asked if they would ever hear the letters read aloud. William smiled, but his eyes carried a shadow. "One day," he said, "when the time is right, and when her voice can be heard exactly as she meant it to be." In the weeks that followed, the palace announced a grand public exhibition honoring Diana's humanitarian legacy. Officially, it marked the anniversary of one of her most celebrated campaigns. Unofficially, it was a message. Her story was not up for erasure. Preparations moved quickly. Enlarged photographs of her overseas visits were restored, her most moving speeches printed in bold across towering panels. At the heart of the gallery, a glass case held a selection of her personal belongings, tokens of a life driven by compassion and courage. The unveiling drew immense crowds. Applause rolled like a wave as William, Catherine, George, and Charlotte cut the ribbon. Above the entrance in gleaming gold were the words, "Diana, a voice that endures." Inside, visitors moved in hushed awe, some quietly wiping tears. Camilla's absence was conspicuous. Officially, she was said to be resting at a private estate. Unofficially, the silence around her told its own story. For William, the exhibition was not simply a tribute, it was a vow. His mother's voice would echo through time, untouchable and unbroken. This is not the kind of story that fades to black. It lingers, like a shadow at the edge of candlelight, through echoing palace halls and behind doors guarded by loyalty and fear. Somewhere in the vaults, Diana's letters lie untouched, but their silence roars. Her words, unseen, now travel farther than paper ever could. Etched into memory, etched into truth, etched into history itself. Some say the past can be buried. They forget that the ground remembers. If you're ready to dig deeper into the secrets they pray you'll forget, subscribe now and step into the story they don't want told.